Hello world, welcome to the Byte Size Podcast. Today we'll be talking about CPUs, specifically what they are and what makes them fast. So if you read one of our articles, you would know that a CPU is known as the computer's central processing unit. In other words, the CPU is a giant calculator that allows your computer to work. So every time you move your mouse, use your touchpad, or tap on a touchscreen, your computer uses math to sort of triangulate where your cursor is moving, and whether or not you clicked or tapped on something. This is just one example of what a CPU does, and of course, the CPU doesn't just allow your computer cursor to work, your CPU does most of everything on your computer. Programs and apps on your computer are called software, and it's this software that gives instructions to your CPU. The CPU then completes these tasks and moves on to the next instruction. Alright, hopefully you understand what a CPU is. Now let's talk about what makes a CPU fast. So if you're familiar with modern CPUs, and at the time of this writing, x86 based CPUs, basically, business computer CPUs, pretty much, as of now. You may have heard of the term core, clock speed, and TDP when looking at or buying different CPUs for a computer if you're ever planning to build one. Now these terms are really vague, and some people consider more cores means a faster computer, or a higher clock speed means it's faster, and a higher TDP means a bigger number, which means faster CPU, right? But this may not always be the case. So let's go over these terms one by one. First, let's talk about clock speed. So if you are familiar with, a clock, right? You may know that a clock ticks 60 times per minute. In computer terms, this clock would work at 1 hertz because it ticks once per second. Alright, now let's talk about a CPU. So for our example, I will talk about the Intel Core i5-7600 CPU, which came out in about early 2017. It has a max turbo frequency is like hertz, right? Or basically it has a maximum clock speed of 4.1 gigahertz. All right. And 4.1, that's a kind of big number, right? I don't know. But for context, 4.1 gigahertz is the equivalent of 4.1 billion hertz. That means that a CPU's clock speed is 4.1 billion little calculations per second. So it's no surprise that more little calculations mean more performance. It means your computer is faster, and your computer feels smoother to work with. Though I should mention what IPC, or inter-process communication, is. That was my robot impression. So while a computer with a high clock speed might be able to calculate billions of calculations per second, those calculations may be very small. A higher IPC means a CPU can carry more data or information per calculation. That kind of rhymed. That's cool. Therefore, a higher clock speed with a higher IPC means a fast CPU overall. Next, let's talk about a core. A core, which is often broken down into threads, is sort of like a piece of a CPU. Oftentimes, while your computer is calculating where your mouse is moving, it may also be calculating that one movie you're watching in the background, that game of solitaire you're playing, and you might even be talking to someone or typing up an email. Modern CPUs are masters at multitasking, as they break themselves down into these cores and threads. One core might work on instructions from your keyboard, and another might work on instructions from the movie you may be watching. In the past, where CPUs relied on a single core, those programs had to wait their turn to be calculated. It's like a line in a supermarket. Having more cores is kind of like having more checkout lines. In general, a higher clock speed with a high IPC and more cores mean a faster CPU. Finally, let's talk about what TDP is. TDP stands for Thermal Design Power, and it is a bit confusing to understand. So, TDP is measured in watts, which, if you're familiar with electronics, is a measurement of power and electricity. However, computer CPUs are more complicated because TDP is not exactly a measure of how much power or electricity a CPU needs. Instead, it is a measurement of the heat that is produced from a CPU. To make matters worse, whenever a CPU uses or draws more watts, it becomes hotter because it is performing more calculations it's a kerfuffle, okay? However, in general, a CPU with a higher TDP should have better cooling to perform well. If your CPU gets too hot, it will turn its clock speed down. However, if you cool it with an adequate fan or water cooler, it may boost or raise its clock speed, depending on how hot the CPU is. Like I said, TDP is a little confusing even for me, so if you're interested where I got this information from, there's these people called Techquickie on YouTube, and they have a video on it. Also, thank you, Linus. That's Techquickie on YouTube. So hopefully you're a little more familiar with what a CPU is and what makes it faster or slower. Anyways, thanks for listening.